The U.S. orders a Chinese consulate to close as consulate staff burn classified papers. The Chinese ambassador is lost for words when asked about Uyghur concentration camps and happy anniversary of murdering people. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Surfshark. You should be using a VPN like Surfshark to protect yourself whenever you go online. So, people knew something was up when an unusual number of fire trucks showed up outside the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas this week. Since it is Texas, my first thought was the Chinese consulate was having an outdoor barbecue. But it was much less fun than that. Consulate staff were burning classified documents.
Reports of someone burning classified documents at the Chinese consulate. A source tells us the consulate is being evicted by 4 p.m. this Friday. Neighbors called 911 saying they spotted someone burning those documents in the courtyard, but when Houston firefighters arrived, they were not allowed on the property.
Obviously, the burning question here is, what happened to the consulate's paper shredders? But after the document burning, it was confirmed that the U.S. is ordering the Chinese consulate in Houston to close.
A State Department spokeswoman said China was asked to close the Houston consulate, quote, in order to protect American intellectual property and Americans' private information, but did not give specifics.
I have a feeling that we may never get all of the specifics, at least not officially. But Senator Marco Rubio, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said the Chinese consulate in Houston was not a true diplomatic facility, but the central node of the Communist Party's vast network of spies and influence operations in the U.S. U.S. law enforcement officials also compiled a document of investigations linked to the Houston consulate. Those include attempts to steal research, to recruit researchers to steal research, and to try to force Chinese citizens whom the Chinese government has deemed as wanted fugitives to return to China. According to David R. Stilwell, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, China's attempted scientific thefts in the United States had accelerated over the last 6 months and could be related to efforts to develop a vaccine for the coronavirus. The U.S. Justice Department has also accused Chinese hackers of trying to steal research on what could become a cure for the coronavirus. You know, the coronavirus. The deadly virus the Chinese Communist Party tried to cover up, which is why you spent months in lockdown. That coronavirus, which is why I call it the CCP virus. But regardless of why the U.S. government shut down the consulate, the Chinese Communist Party is very upset.
Beijing is threatening retaliation. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson called the request a political provocation.
China strongly condemns such an outrageous and unjustified move which will sabotage China-U.S. relations. We urge the U.S. to immediately withdraw its erroneous decision, otherwise China will make a legitimate and necessary response.
A source with direct knowledge of the matter said China was considering closing the U.S. consulate in Wuhan in turn.
Oh no, the U.S. consulate in Wuhan? The epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak? Gosh, what a devastating loss. Especially since the consulate was closed and the staff evacuated in January. However, as of this recording, some sources are reporting that the U.S. consulate in Chengdu could be shut instead. You know, I would be sad to lose the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. Back in 2012, Wang Lijun, the police chief of Chongqing, escaped to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. He didn't stay in the consulate for long, but that incident exposed a crazy story of murder, corruption, organ harvesting, and a possible coup. It ended up taking down hugely powerful Chinese Communist Party officials. That story was one of the reasons I started China Uncensored. And here we are 8 years later. But even without their consulate in Houston, China still has 4 consulates in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, as well as an embassy in D.C. Speaking of Chinese consulates, the one in San Francisco, is apparently harboring a military-linked fugitive scientist. U.S. federal prosecutors have accused the scientist, Tang Juan, of visa fraud for concealing her links to the People's Liberation Army on her visa application. Tang was working as a researcher at the University of California, Davis. But an investigation revealed that she worked at a PLA-affiliated university in China, and she is considered to be active military personnel. After being visited by the FBI in June, Tang fled to the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. You know, I'm starting to wonder what goes on at these consulates. Of course, closing the Houston consulate is just part of the Trump administration ramping up pressure on the Chinese Communist Party. Or, as the New York Times calls it, a blanket anti-China message to appeal to his supporters in recent weeks. Wow, someone must be trying hard to get back into China. But yes, the desperate election bid included blacklisting 11 more Chinese companies that are using Uyghur slave labor or were conducting genetic analyses used to further the repression of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. It's been called halal organ harvesting, which has absolutely ruined the halal food carts for me. Thank you. But the U.S. pressure on China doesn't stop there. The House voted to ban TikTok on federal devices, mainly because Bernie Sanders' account was getting really painful. And we'll have more China news headlines after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In a move that is sure to make the Communist Party furious, the U.S. State Department has issued a statement condemning the party's brutal persecution of Falun Gong. Falun Gong is that meditation practice that used to be super popular in China, before authorities started killing people for it. And this past week marked the 21-year anniversary of the Communist Party's persecution campaign. Congratulations, Chinese Communist Party! You've gotten away with murdering Falun Gong for 21 years with practically no consequences. Well, it's probably bad karma or something. But whatever, they'll cross that bridge when they come to it. And then, that bridge will collapse into a river of fire. You don't want to mess with bad karma. Speaking of Falun Gong, this week, the human rights group the Lantos Foundation and 21 Wilberforce called out the New York Times for religious discrimination of Falun Gong. It has to do with this article. Basically, being victims of the Chinese Communist Party, some Falun Gong practitioners developed a tool called UltraSurf to get around China's internet firewall. They were seeking State Department funding for UltraSurf. UltraSurf has been used by millions of people to get around China's Great Firewall and around internet firewalls in authoritarian countries like Iran. As the Lantos Foundation / 21 Wilberforce joint statement puts it, in describing tools used to circumvent the internet firewall in closed countries, the reporters made no fewer than 9 references to the personal beliefs and religious practices of 2 developers. Though several other technology companies, NGOs, and other individuals were written about, none of their religious affiliations were mentioned. They point out that if the New York Times used the same treatment for developers who were Catholic, Muslim, or Jewish, there would have been an outcry, and rightly so. Yet the Times' denigrating coverage of Falun Gong is no different and should be condemned in equal terms. Choosing a small persecuted religion to single out does not make the bigotry any more palatable. So, the New York Times wrote a bigoted article that criticizes Falun Gong because 2 people who practice it develop tools that promote internet freedom in China? Like I said, someone must be trying really hard to get back into China. But the U.S. doesn't want to go against the Chinese Communist Party alone. This week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled to the U.K., where he met with Prime Minister British Donald Trump. Pompeo said the U.S. wants to build a global coalition to counter China's disgraceful menace. Speaking of disgraceful menace, the Chinese ambassador in the UK had a real hard time answering questions about this drone footage from last year. It shows hundreds of blindfolded men being led from a train with vests that say Kashgar Detention Center.
Can you tell us what is happening here?
Uncomfortable silence, you say? Yeah, he wasn't expecting that question. But eventually, he responds.
Xinjiang is regarded as the most beautiful place in Xinjiang.
Perfect answer. Surely there's no possible retort.
Ambassador, that is not beautiful coverage.
Lousy, no good British. What about the Opium Wars? Haven't they done enough to try to embarrass China? The interview goes downhill from there.
When we see interviews like that, and we see people blindfolded and led off to trains to be taken to re-education camps, it reminds people in the West what was going on in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s.
That's totally wrong. There's no such a concentration camp in Xinjiang. You know, there's a lot.
Okay.
There's a lot of fake. We are in the modern, we are in the information age.
Sorry.
You know, media,
Okay,
they make
let me
all
remind you,
kinds of
Ambassador.
fake accusation against China.
You know, I almost feel bad for him. Oh wait, no I don't. Speaking of Xinjiang, the NBA is no longer operating a basketball training center there. The NBA had been in Xinjiang since 2016, which was the same year that the Chinese Communist Party started turning the entire region into a giant prison. It's not clear why the NBA set up in Xinjiang in the first place. I guess they must have heard it was beautiful. And over to Hong Kong, where, once again, police and protesters clashed. The protest marked the year anniversary of a brutal attack against protesters by men wearing white shirts. Police were criticized for not responding fast enough back then, but they sure responded fast enough this week. And activist Joshua Wong has announced he will be running for the Hong Kong legislature. The Chinese Communist Party will be very unhappy if he wins, but not to worry. I'm sure they'll just find a way to disqualify him if he does. But a tiny bit of good news for Hong Kong. The UK ended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong, and it will extend its China arms embargo to the city. Basically, this means the UK is recognizing that Hong Kong is now just another mainland Chinese city, which is why I recommend, if you're in Hong Kong, you should probably be using a VPN to protect yourself whenever you go online. I recommend Surfshark, and not just because this episode has been sponsored by Surfshark, but also because the Hong Kong and Beijing governments can now watch everything you do, since you're basically in mainland China now. But of course, besides protecting your identity, there's another advantage to using a VPN. You can access websites that are only available in other countries. For example, let's say that after this, you still don't have enough action in your life, and you want to binge watch all 9 seasons of 24. Well, you can't access 24 on Netflix in the US. So, use Surfshark to switch your location to Germany, refresh, and now you have 9 days straight of pure Jack Bauer kicking butt. In fact, there's tons of TV shows and movies that you can only watch if you're logged into Netflix in another country by using a VPN like Surfshark. Try out Surfshark now with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And Surfshark has a special discount for China Uncensored fans. Go to surfshark.com/uncensored and use the code UNCENSORED to get 85% off a 2-year plan and 3 extra months for free. Click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.